Hello, everyone, and welcome to our September Unplugged event. We are so excited to have our panelists today. Today, we're going to be talking about education and ableism in education. It's back to school season, so we thought this was a very opportune time to have this conversation with all of you. The experience of those of us in the disabled community is a unique one. So we have several guests here today, and before we get started with questions and the discussion, I would love to just a couple notes to go over. For those of you who have questions, we've shared a Google Doc link. If you don't want to ask your questions via the Zoom, if you don't like being on camera, or if you have to leave early or something like that, you can drop your questions in there and we'll discuss those with our panelists at the end of the session. Closed captioning there should be a link there. I think we also have the live transcript going. We also have ASL interpreters today. We have Justine and Sadia. And that should be all the logistical notes for today. Before we go ahead and introduce our panelists and get started with our conversation. So I'm Catherine Lewis. I am the content manager for Diversability, and I am a Caucasian woman with long dark hair. I'm wearing black glasses, and I am sitting on a dark colored office chair. And I would like to introduce all of our panelists today. Jade, can you introduce yourself briefly and give a visual description, and then we'll go through our other panelists and then get started.
Absolutely. All right. Oh, we've really run into it.
I forgot your name sounded so similar. I'm sorry. Jade, and then we'll go to Jay. How about that?
All right. So, hi, my name is Jade. I am a 28-year-old Caucasian woman with red hair. I'm wearing a blue button-up shirt and my background is blurred. I also have glasses on. I am an adjunct professor.
And hi, everybody. My name's Jay. I use he, him pronouns. I'm a Caucasian, middle-aged male. I'm wearing dark black glasses and a pink shirt, and my background is white. My work is in disability rights, disability justice, disability studies, and I focus on higher education, but I'm interested in talking today and thinking through some of the connections and intersections between K-12 and higher education.
Thank you, Jay. Merlyna, can you introduce yourself?
Sure. Good evening, everyone. My name is Merlyna Valentine. I am an African-American woman with short hair. I have on a blue shirt with black trim. And my background would be that in my hotel as I'm displaced from the hurricane. I am a lifelong educator. I was an educator for 30 years, elementary school principal in my final years, and now I'm a consultant and a speaker, and I'm also a quadruple amputee.
Thank you. Victor, can you please introduce yourself to us? Okay, I don't know what's going on there, but we'll go ahead and start the conversation. My first question today, talking about, accessible learning and ableism in education. All of you were discussing with us today that you have vastly different experiences and you've all served in very different roles within the education system. What is your perspective on educational ableism and where within the process of education you find it most impactful? Jay, I would like to hear from you first. What is your perspective from your experiences?
I think what I'm noticing, and I think the last 18 or 20 years, or 18 or 20, feels that long, 18 or 20 months during the pandemic, during the awareness that we have around racial violence. It's been, like I said, it's 18 years, a long 18 months. But what I'm realizing is that we have a group of students that are coming into college and university who are experiencing the kind of disabling impacts of the systems in which we work and live. And at the same time, they're less likely to ask for help. And that is a really dangerous and difficult situation. And a lot of the messages that they're being given are about them having to help themselves. And that's a way to shift responsibility away from the ways that our systems need to change. So it's a bad trend. I think that I don't want to go too deep, much more deeply into that, because I realize we're looking for a quick bit of input here, but that's what I'm noticing is two twinned trends. One is that students are experiencing especially further disabling impacts in terms of especially mental health, and two, that they're less likely to ask for help.
Thank you, Jay, for that perspective. Merlyna, can you please kind of tell us where you think ableism in education is most impactful, given your experiences and the roles that you've been in?
For me, I had an enlightening experience. I became a quadruple amputee at the age of 41, and I was a first year principal. And so I fought my way to return to that school and to become the principal again. And so I have a different lens that I look at it now than when I was a beginning teacher and I was an inclusion teacher. Had numerous special education students in my classroom with regular education students. And at the time, I had no idea that some of the things that were impacting the learning in the classroom for all students were really going on, until I had this different perspective of seeing the world through my lens as a person with a disability. And when I returned, I quickly noticed how many times for my own self as an adult, people were trying to fix my disability or to fix me or to make me fit into what the world has as the default mindset of what life should be like. And so I think it's most impactful when we're trying to have students become a part of our culture in the school and making sure that we're welcoming to all students. And we always have the sayings and the slogans that say, all students can learn and achieve at high levels. But there was this very distinct group of students that were not achieving. And I think there were a lot of expectations, lowered expectations and assumptions and beliefs made about students with disabilities in their setting, in the special education classroom, as well as when they were included into a regular education setting. And so I think it's very impactful for us to look at the mindsets of the educators, the parents, the families, the students, as we try to navigate the fact that in our building, we wanted as much inclusion as we could have, and diversity and inclusion are topics that, as Jay said, have in the last 18 to 20 months just skyrocketed and exploded in every conference I've been to. But I think there's the fact that it focuses a lot on race, and sometimes we are an afterthought when we think about including students with disabilities in that particular conversation. So that's kind of where I'm at now with the work that I'm doing, trying to ensure that we're not an afterthought when we're thinking about how to make sure access and opportunity happens for all students.
Thank you for that insight. And you talked a lot about, intersectionality and how to balance that. And I assure you, we will circle back to that because I think that's a huge part of this conversation. Jay kind of touched on it a little bit too, but I do want to hear from Jade on her perspective of where ableism is most pervasive before we start digging into those deep, those really deeper levels of this conversation. But I do want to say thank you for touching on that because I do think that that is such an important part of this conversation. Jade, what is your perspective as, you know, someone who's been a student and also an educator, where you find ableism to be most impactful in the education system?
So this kind of piggybacks off what everyone has said already, but kind of adding to that, the biggest thing I see is kind of this divide between students with disabilities or who have, you know, extra needs and students who are quote unquote, you know, normal students. So for example, COVID happened, everyone kind of went to, at least at my school, we went to a hybrid model. That was really beneficial for some people because, you know, people with disabilities have been asking for a hybrid model for so long. But then it's like, now, you know, when things are starting to shift back to normal, or, you know, people perceive they're shifting back to normal, suddenly we're losing that ability, the hybrid ability, for example. And it's those things that as a professor and as a student that I see the loss in, just because attendance, for example, if you have a disability or chronic illness, and like I have an attendance policy, I have to have an attendance policy because if I don't, my students don't show up. But at the same time, there are some professors that adhere to that attendance policy so strictly that if a student has a disability or something, keeping them from rightly not attending class, you know, then it actually becomes a problem and starts to bring their grade down. So that's kind of where I see the imbalance most, is just in how we grade things and how do we make things equal for students who have disabilities and students who are like normal, quote unquote, and who don't have, you know, these extra challenges that we may have.
That's a really good point as well, that as things have started to shift, you know, from very much in the thick of the pandemic, when the disabled community really was very excited about some of these changes that were happening. And we heard lots of calls for this to continue as we shift back to normal. And now we're kind of seeing it not shift back to that. And I mean, sorry, not continue. And we're seeing this shift away from the models that benefited our community so very much. What do you think? I would like to hear from Merlyna first. What do you think about the fact that education is quote unquote going back to normal, and how it could potentially affect students with disabilities both positively and negatively? How do you think that's going to look as we continue this evolution of education for our students at all levels?
Well, recently just visiting several schools that are now fully in person, and that virtual piece has been removed. It has shown a great divide for all students. Many students are arriving at the doors having what we call learning loss, but more than that, it's the social emotional piece that is huge for all students. And so my biggest concern is that students that do require that you know, intentional and deliberate delivery of some type of social and emotional support would suffer greatly, because they're coming back with trauma, as all of us probably have experienced in the last 18 to 20 months. And they need that support, and they need things that are beyond what many people are trained to provide. And so what I'm seeing now are classrooms that have students who are dealing with trauma and who are in need of support, and you know, classrooms that will support them, and teachers are not very informed in some places of what to do. And so my concern is, as we bring everyone back on campus, and that we have, in-person learning, that there are some very different needs for all students, and then especially for our students with disabilities who may have, had things happen during this time when they were virtual or they were not in person, and that we have to be able to address those needs. And so I'm seeing a great need for training and resources and support for our classrooms that have, needs that we had not really seen prior to the pandemic at this level. And it involves a lot around the social and emotional wellness of our children. And, so I'm very concerned that that is something that we really need to be focusing on as much as we're focusing on the academic loss. There are things that need to be addressed for those students.
Jay, what are your thoughts about how things are going to impact students with disabilities as we see the shift from, a lot of accessible features in education kind of away from that again? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, so I think we need to keep the receipts on a few things. So first, to begin with, I think Jade said it so well. We were pushing for a very long time for things like graded attendance and that kind of quantified idea of participation because they were ableist, right? We were fighting those things. And they're based on a kind of factory version of education that doesn't match with the way that any educator wants to characterize their own teaching, right? They're just about compliance and a really strict time regime, which is nothing like a workplace, for example, a contemporary workplace, or at least not like the workplaces that we aspire for our students to be working in. But more than that, okay, we also did things like we halted numerical grades. We gave students pass-fail options. For faculty, we extended their deadlines to things like tenure, right? Those things we have to keep the receipts on too. Because we were told that these things were intransigent, were unchangeable. And that was wrong. It was something we did within the course of a week. So we know that institutions are highly changeable, in fact. That's really important because we need to keep pushing for change. And now we can hold up the receipts and say, what were the outcomes? What were the outcomes on student mental health of shifting from graded to credit, no credit, right? What was the impact of suspending final exams in the winter or spring term of 2020, right? We have to do that because what we actually saw was a ricochet back in another direction around things like time testing, around rigor, right? Around situating all students as potential cheaters. At the same time as a lot of, for instance, disability professionals were not part of the conversations about what online teaching was going to look like. We've not been part of the conversations about what back to campus would look like. Big companies that do surveillance test proctoring, they all zipped right into those conversations and asserted themselves as a need, right? And we know what that impact has had on student mental health. We know that it's been racist. We know that it's been ableist, right? At some point, I mean, so there's this sense, and I know on my own campus, it feels like a zombie university. Some people are there, some people aren't. But the biggest, strangest thing is all of the shared governance, the ways that students, staff, and faculty used to be part of decision-making is gone. These meetings are all happening in the absence of the stakeholders who matter the most, right? And so we need to get back in those meetings, right? We need to be back at the table. And when we go back to the table, I think there are things we need to push for that were changes that were made, right? And I think we need to hold up the receipts and say, it's time for a radical change to how we do this. And I think what Merlyna said as well, like students are changed. Our culture has changed. Community has changed. There's no way to go back to, quote unquote, normal. We're dealing with a group of students who are traumatized, and we need a trauma-informed approach to how we go back to campus. I know that was a lot packed into an answer, but just to say, I think I am summarizing and repeating things that other people are saying here as well.
Jade, this is Catherine. Jade, what are your thoughts? You know, you're the one that kind of brought this all about, this conversation about, hey, we had these great resources during the pandemic as the disabled community, and now they're taking them away from us. How do you think that's going to impact our community? And do you think that there's a way forward to be able to change that trend?
Well, I feel like that's kind of a loaded question, but yeah, it's totally going to change. I mean, it's going to change a lot of things. I mean, it depends whether, you know, do we try and go back to normal, or do we try to make things better? And like, ultimately, hopefully we try and make things better. Obviously, it depends on, for example, like the school or the university or whatever you're talking about. From my point of view, I only really know from the university level how things are going and where things might go. I think a lot of it is ultimately going to come down to the professors themselves, instead of like, you know, I would love to see it come from higher up, and for, you know, admins to be like, hey, we'd love it if everyone recorded every single class and had a transcript for every single class, and, you know, made things more accessible in these ways, and we're going to train you how. Well, that's probably, at least at my university, I don't think that'll happen, at least not, you know, right now. Maybe eventually, and hopefully maybe that's something I can push for. But, you know, I think that's going to come down to the professors themselves and the things that they want to keep offering after COVID. So like for me, you know, I'm really trying to, every day I log on Zoom during class, so that, you know, if a student needs to attend via Zoom, like that's totally fine with me. They're there. If a student, you know, needs a transcript or you need the recorded class, like that's there for them. Just kind of supplying them with those extra things that, you know, we had during COVID that I don't necessarily want to take away. But ultimately, I think it's going to come down to the teachers themselves, unfortunately, instead of, you know, being kind of like a broad thing.
Thank you all for that. As we're kind of talking about some of the accessible accommodations that were available to us, especially during this last year, and, you know, we're talking a lot about students. And I think all of you have spent some role, sometime as an educator in some capacity. Does it look the same for those who are educators, or is it more difficult to have accommodations as an educator, as a student, or is it just different? Jay, can you kind of tell us a little bit about that and how it differs from the experience of students as an educator with disabilities?
Hi, Jay. This is Tiffany. Sorry, I just wanted to drop in really quickly, Katie, and see if we could have Michelle and Dr. Pineda introduce themselves. They're also panelists.
Okay.
Michelle, go ahead and unmute.
Yeah, I asked them to introduce themselves, and then there was silence. So I didn't know what was going on there.
Hi, this is Victor Pineda. I'm a faculty member at UC Berkeley. I teach in the Department of City and Regional Planning. And I have quite enjoyed the conversation so far. When I started to log in, I had mentioned that unfortunately I'm en route from Los Angeles to Berkeley. That I wanted to just share a few ideas with this audience, but unfortunately, folks are able to stay for the whole time. Okay. For those that can't see me because my camera's off, because I'm a 40-year-old Latinx man with brown hair, brown eyes, just a ventilator on my face, a mask that allows me to breathe, and I sit in an electric wheelchair. Thank you.
Thank you for that intro, Michelle.
Hi, everyone. My name is Michelle Aldas. I go by she, her as well. I am currently wearing a maroon dress with golden dots. I have long black curly hair. I'm currently sitting in my mobility aid as we speak. I am a graphic design student at a Palm Beach State College here in Florida, but I'm also the SGA president here at the college as well. Thank you.
Thank you guys for those intros. Sorry for the miscommunication. I didn't see that you guys were here, so I thought that you guys were not here yet. So I want to back up and hear from both of you a little bit about some of the things that we've talked about, you know, what your experiences with ableism have been and how you think things are changing during and, you know, post-pandemic, and how you think that we can avoid returning to some of the inherent ableist things that happen in the education system. Michelle, can you speak to that a little bit first?
Of course. Pre-COVID, it was very hard to ask for all in COVID. COVID kind of was like a branch to actually make everybody see how I went through it, how I felt on a daily basis. You know, sometimes exhausted from being in class or being on campus and not having the right resources to be able to be the best student that I could be. COVID kind of made those things visible to those around me as students, and also and made me actually want to become part of the student government on campus. So Jay was kind of explaining how all those meetings were being done behind closed doors. A lot of the stuff that was being discussed with the campus was not being discussed with all the students or having a representative there. And that's what made me want to join SGA, was because of that. I wanted to be that student that had that voice, not only for my community, for those that are part of it but are not comfortable calling themselves disabled just yet, or part of the CSA office, which is the Center of Student Accessibility on our campus, but are not active. So the part is that some of these meetings were only held on campus while I hadn't even gotten my vaccine yet, while it was not an even accessible meeting yet. So that was one of the most ableistic things that I said. I was like, well, why are we having all these representatives only have those meetings on campus? Why can't we be included in the meeting? Then the second thing was that student government wasn't even told about those meetings. The student trustee wasn't even told about those meetings. So I started having to ask those really rough questions about, if I'm administration, like, hey, why are we not included? Why is the student trustee not there? Why are we not being included in those meetings on a daily basis with the provost, with the cleaning crew, with how to access that? And then when we came back on campus, which unfortunately I live in the state of Florida, and things started to open up, and some of us didn't even have the opportunity of closing, really. And our school was told, you either open or you lose funding, and we're a state school. So unfortunately, when they made that decision, as SGA president, without being completely vaccinated, I had to come back on campus and asking for cleaning supplies or asking for any of the accommodations or the second screen at the SGA office. I became SGA president through summer in August, and I got back on campus in the September, and my screen had not been there. None of the accommodations have been served. So it started to see, like, if I'm the SGA president and supposedly I'm the leader of the students on campus and I'm not being heard, I can only imagine how my peers felt. So I started to kind of build those relationships currently with the department that I'm part of, and then reaching out to other departments, seeing how the faculty felt. And as SGA saying, like, hey, if you have difficulty learning these, have you been asked to learn them? Can we help you as students? We're a little bit more tech savvy than you. Can we teach you? Like, all those questions. And a lot of the students were stating that if we hadn't done that or pushed the school to do it, they wouldn't have gotten those accommodations, even with the student of disabilities still there. And we started to hear from faculty stating that even though they had asked for the training, it was completely ignored. And a lot of our faculty, because we are a state school, is an adjunct faculty. So they don't have offices and you can't go in person and talk to them. So it felt like it was just kind of both sided. They were not getting what they needed to be able to offer to the students. And we started to create a campaign for change. But those were the ableistic things that I saw as a leader. I can only see I can only feel like how my other peers are feeling right now.
Thank you for that. Can we hear from Jay?
Hi, how are you? Nice to meet you guys. I just got in. I'm sorry for the late arrival.
You're totally fine.
Nice to meet you, Catherine, Sadia, Merlyna, Michelle. This is my first like public event attendance, but I had been on an interview with Madeline Bratti. I can't remember the name. And so it's nice to meet you all. I'm just going to be taking some notes because this event, it really attracted some interest to me.
Hey Jay, this is
I've already gone to school.
Jay,
Yeah,
Jay, we're gonna get to questions at the end of the event, but we're gonna hear from the panelists first, if that's okay.
Go ahead. Yes. No, go ahead.
Hi, Victor. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience with ableism and how you think we can avoid returning to some of that?
Yeah, let me start off by just putting things into context. I helped work on the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. I also served on the US Federal Access Board. So there's a lot of policies in place beyond the ADA that work to create a moment in time within which COVID disrupted things. And so I feel like the work that I've done with others to create new laws, create new standards on disability justice were both accelerated from a positive perspective, but also disrupted from a negative perspective. And the important thing is that we can come together and assess how these changes are affecting people. So at a very practical level, I also, besides advising governments and working on laws and working on regulations, I also teach. And the day-to-day reality, like the other speakers have said, is both creating at the same time hope for new ways of engagement, but also creating frustrations because these policies and procedures are all being tested in different ways. So my contribution from a macro perspective and working it over 24 countries on disability laws and policies is that there's a lot of ways that we're going to continue to get things wrong. And there's a lot of ways that we're going to get some things right. The important thing is to have these conversations and support each other in establishing the new standard, the new status quo, and not be afraid of being loud and being seen and repeating the same thing that we've always said, which is nothing about us without us, which is the opportunity to build back better. And what that means is if the systems were creating more challenges and more forms of ableist exclusion, how do we build in mechanisms as we are defining what the new normal looks like? So I don't have any specific things. I haven't taught last year. I mean, I taught online last year. I'm still not on campus, but I think for me, my is going to have to be much more hybrid. It is going to have to be much more based on the ways that I can make a contribution. If my department doesn't want to extend those accommodations to me, or I need to be able enough to draw in on the fact that we can build sort of that culture so that at least in my department, we figure out how to meet students and meet faculty with disabilities where there are. But I don't think there's gonna be a silver bullet. I think it's gonna be a lot of trials and errors, a lot of growing pains, but we need to be fixed on the same outcome, which is what didn't work in the past has to change, and we're not willing to compromise well-being and our capacity to contribute because of these outdated ways of doing things. There's a new way. We have to be very loud about what that new way is, and not take, not take these trials and errors in a defeatist approach, nor take these things that don't work as the ultimate no, because there's a much longer set of disruptions that are going to come. What is the next pandemic? Or the use of AI in teaching, or all kinds of other things that are coming down the pipeline. We just need to be vigilant. This is one of many disruptions, and making sure that it works in our favor, not against us. I'm going to stay a little bit longer, but we'll have to end a little bit early. I want to thank all the speakers. I also thank Tiffany for allowing us to join the conversation.
Thank you for that insight. So we've talked kind of a lot about how ableism has become very pervasive and how the last year and a half has really changed the ability for those of us in the community to get the kinds of accessible education that we need. But I want to talk a little bit about not only ableism, but what accessible education actually is. So we've talked quite a bit about what it's not and the problems that arise from that not being available to us. And one of you, I can't remember who, touched on special education services for students versus integrated classroom settings. And I would really like to hear from you about whether you think that it's more beneficial for students and educators to have students learn alongside their peers in integrated classrooms, or if it's better for students to have those special education services to be able to get those kinds of additional accommodations that they may need. Jade, can you please start us off with this question?
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, I mean, obviously the current education system, it's not really designed to accommodate students with certain types of disabilities in integrated classrooms. My school, for example, like there are some old buildings, and if somebody has a mobility aid, like a wheelchair, it's really difficult to get from level 1 to level 2 just because there's pretty much only one elevator and there's no guarantee that it's working all the time. So kind of those things are obviously an issue. I'd say also that there are no obviously designated courses for students with disabilities, at least at my university. So I feel like accommodations can obviously be made with professors, and like usually there's a wonderful accessibility service office, or at least I think at most schools, which hopefully allows students to remain in integrated classrooms, which I think is important because of the social aspect especially, and kind of getting the whole experience. Like when I was a student and I was dealing with my disability, which is Crohn's disease, and I was being diagnosed and I was dealing with everything, hospitalizations. If I was also separated kind of from my classroom and from the people that I had been with, my friends, that would have just been another kind of punch in the gut. So I think it's really important that, if possible, everyone is kept together. I feel like, obviously, I think professors try their best. I don't really know from a perspective of teaching other grades at all. but, you know, I feel like educators just generally aren't trained, don't have the resources, et cetera, to help students in the way that they would realistically want to. You know, as I was saying before, I think it's something that individual professors and individual teachers kind of aim for just themselves. But the sad thing is that obviously, you know, if you have a professor or a teacher who has never experienced disability, they're not going to be thinking in the same way, because obviously it's not like a big thing in their life. They're not thinking about it 24/7 like the rest of us are. So I don't know, that makes it a lot more difficult. I think, yeah, it's a very big conversation. And I feel like, obviously, as we were saying with COVID, we had some of these things and a lot of professors might keep them. I'm hoping a lot of professors at my college keep them. I hope it allows students to remain in integrated classrooms, but I have a feeling that we will see some, you know, we're going to see a backslide no matter what in some aspects.
Merlyna, can you kind of tell us a little bit about whether you think integrated classrooms or continuing special education services is more beneficial?
Absolutely. And I'm going to speak from the elementary perspective. That's where the bulk of my experiences are. I will tell you that in the elementary classrooms that I've had the privilege to either lead or teach in, integrated classrooms were more prevalent than non-integrated classrooms. We call them inclusion classrooms, and the special education teacher, paraprofessional, and the regular education teacher all co-taught the classes. And I believe it was even more beneficial to the students without disabilities to learn with their peers who had disabilities. It created this culture of inclusion. And in our school, our goal was that we would not only just tolerate our differences, but to actually celebrate our differences. And so we created that kind of environment by having all of our students learn together. All students want to learn, to grow, to play, to be seen, to be heard. And so I believe that when we do that, when we focus on that, and if true equity is the goal of all of our schools, then that's what we've got to do. We've got to move to having all students learn and grow together. Now, I do believe there are specific times where a special case might happen and a student may need to be in a different setting for sensory issues or different things that we've had in my experiences. But for the majority of our students, they were very successful in a classroom that was with full inclusion and with people who were committed and trained and just dedicated to making it work. Those students want to learn in a positive environment. They want to feel supported. And when we do that with everyone together, it is beneficial to all students. So I've seen it become very successful. I can tell you of a specific case of a student who worked closely with a student with disabilities, a regular education student, and his post-secondary experience was that he decided he wanted to work in a field of biomedical engineering because he wanted to focus on providing some support to the student that he had grown very close to throughout his time in that classroom that was fully integrated. And his career choice was a direct result of the impact that that student had on his life. And so that to me is, I think, the full circle moment as an educator to see that those students embraced each other so much that later in life, that child became ultra sensitive to what this student had to deal with and decided that he wanted to help students and to help people in the world have access and opportunity. As his career choice, it became his passion and purpose, all because at a very young age, he was able to learn beside that student and to actually have empathy and compassion and learn what it takes to be able to just, live and exist in this world. And so I think there is great benefit to having the fully integrated classrooms. I also believe that when you say special education services need improving, that's a big thing that we're going to continue to have to deal with to make sure that when that happens, it is effective, it is successful, it is positive, it is nurturing, and that it provides every student what they need in order to be successful. That's exactly what they need in order to be successful.
Michelle, can you give us your thoughts on that? Thank you, Merlyna. That's a really great way of putting that. Michelle, what are your thoughts?
I honestly think it depends on the age of the student, because obviously is your best advocate, right? So your parent can kind of dictate what kind of need, but also as you grow older, like for example, I'm in university now, I kind of dictate what I feel more comfortable with, right? I dictate if I want a blended classroom, I dictate if I wanted to go virtual, I dictate who I want to be around. But it really depends on each person's disability as well. If it's more of it has an accessibility aid, if it has a neurodivergent component additional to that. It really depends on who you are as part of the disability community. Do I feel like you should be isolated because you're different and put in a corner where the only computer that works for you is 17 steps away from the rest of the classroom? No, I do not agree with that. I feel like it should be integrated with somebody else. And I don't think that sometimes when the high schools or colleges build these equipment, they don't think about that. They just think about where this equipment's going to be, and they don't think about the isolation purposes of what could be causing. Then you might have the other side where the child can't be in person either because of a, let's just say, a ventilator or a severe allergy to the rest of the surroundings. How do we integrate that child into the world because they feel isolated and alone? How do we bring them into in some people want more interaction, some people don't. Some people are okay with them being seen, some are not. So through COVID, I did understand why, turning off the camera at periods of time when you weren't having a good day was an advantage. But now a lot of the professors are seeing that because of the overuse of turning it off by other students, they're like, turn your cameras on. It's mandatory to have it on, and you're having like the worst day possible. And that happened recently to me. I was in my bed while I was doing my classroom, and my teacher was like, well, that must be nice to be in your bed while you are taking class. And I had to bounce back and say, well, yes, unfortunately I have a disability and I need my bed to be here. So I would have to say that it's really about the fact of how comfortable as a student are you to voice that and to be able to, and then as a parent of a younger child, to have those conversations with your child and have their opinion, not just the professionals that are seeing the child, but have their child's opinion about what they're going through as well. And kind of take it from there and maybe do a mix of both worlds at the beginning until they have their own voice to say. But thank you.
So you're kind of the opinion that it depends. Am I right?
Yes, I think it's on a case-by-case basis, but I think that every school, every institution should be ready for those case-to-case basis that should have all those accommodations. And I feel like it's not something that is talked about, and it's only talked about when the situation arises, not be ready or proactive about it.
That's a really unique way of putting that. Jay, can you tell us, do you agree that it depends, or do you think we should stick to one or the other? What are your thoughts?
I am not an expert on K-12 education. So I have some personal experience, but I'm not an expert. I'm enjoying listening to the experts. The only perspective that I might add is that I've been trying to pay attention to research that shows the differences between having something like an individualized education plan, right? Or categories of special education for example, African American males, right? That disproportionately channels those students into often extremely negative outcomes. And so we see this at the college and higher education level, where it's so much more difficult to help those students seek accommodations, but for good reason, right? They've learned that seeking that help is a double-edged sword, right? The other piece for me is looking at students with learning disabilities and realizing that at the K-12 level, I'm going to get the numbers wrong. Don't quote me on the numbers. I'm close, okay? Something like 97% of students diagnosed with learning disabilities get some accommodation at K-12 level. But only 14% of those same students, when they come to university, get accommodations. So again, there's this disjuncture between what we think we need in K-12 and what we have access to. What that means for students along axes of race and class and gender, and then the culture of ableism in higher education that is sending a completely different message around seeking help. So maybe that's a segue, or maybe that's a way to talk about some of these intersections, be they intersections between K-12 and higher ed, or just intersections between ability and race and gender. But as I said, I'm not an expert on this. I will say, you know, in my own family, Dolmage versus the Muskoka Board of Education was the first case fighting for inclusive education in the province of Ontario and in the country of Canada, and we lost. So we moved to another school district so that my brother could go to school with my sister and I. And then after that, it cleared the way for cases that won and established the precedent of being able to go to your neighborhood, your community school, right? But now what happens is all the resources get put in one place, and school boards are willing to fight with lawyers and resources, a lot of money, people who are fighting again for that right. And they can say, no, the resources are at this one school. And so we're back to segregated education all over again. And we have school boards and trustees and principals and vice principals who would rather fight families, right, than allow kids to go to schools in their own communities. So, you know, and this is 50 years later. Now, I guess that is to say it's complicated. It's complicated, and I wish that it was individual students' choice, and I wish that that families were involved and could have an agent of choice, but I think that choice is being taken away.
Merlyna, it sounds like you have some thoughts on this yourself.
No, I kind of agree exactly that it's not one way or another. I think it is, just as Michelle said, a case by case, because there are definitely times where
her volume is so messed up.
Huh?
Her volume is so messed up.
You don't talk. You're
My
not muted.
can you hear me?
If there's some way to go closer to the microphone, I think that might help, but I'm not sure.
No. Let me work on that and you can come back to me.
Okay. Victor, do you have any thoughts on this about, you know, whether or not we should, you know, beef up and change special education services, whether we should do away with them? Oh, Victor left. Okay, sorry. I'm sorry. Okay. Have we heard from all of our panelists on this question? I wanted to make sure that we got thoughts from everyone. I think we have. And I think that you all bring up a really important point, that a lot of students are missing the opportunity, and families are missing the opportunity to have a choice in the matter. And one of the things that Jay brought up is that and I think Jade also brought this up, and Michelle a little bit, that the way accessible learning opportunities look for K through 12 students versus adult students is so vastly different. I want to talk about that briefly. You know, for adult students, while services aren't perfect, it can be much more clear cut. You either have the ADA, you have your disability services, and you have, you know, these legislations. But is it really easier, even though it's a little bit more clear cut? And sometimes I hear about what are the unique barriers to adult students seeking accessible learning, and what are some of your tips for those who might be looking for these opportunities? Michelle, we haven't heard from you in a while. Can you tell us what your experience is and what your tips are for adult students who might be looking for these kinds of, you know, accommodations and services?
Sure. One thing as an advocate outside of being a student, because I advocate for disabilities outside of college, is that the Center of Student Accessibility is not really advertised. One, they don't really have like a representative from the college that to be part of some of the meetings. I have to say that it takes some searching a lot of the times. Also, your 504 capabilities or accommodations that you may have in a high schooler may not all transfer to college. Some may improve, some may weaken. And I think that where you have to go down either with somebody that's advocating for you or a person at that center and go down your 504 plan and try to kind of find that equal medium of what accommodation was offered to you before that can now be offered in college as well. As an adult student, there are a lot of more technologies that I have now that I didn't have in high school that I wish I had, because it would have made my life a lot easier. But I would have to say that a lot of the word disability, there is still that stigma. And unfortunately, that stigma carries even through employment. And, you know, they're kind of saying like, hey, college is the gateway to find your future employer. Are you comfortable? A lot of the colleges, college students are not comfortable being open to saying I'm disabled because it now shows on like, is my employer going to be as accommodating? No, I need to learn in the real world now that I'm in college. Otherwise, I'm not going to succeed in my employment. And that is kind of the philosophy that some colleges kind of push as well. Like when you're going to the career services, do you have a career specialist for disabilities, or it's only the regular career services that you see for the whole campus? So you start to see that little segue. I feel that colleges should have better training on the policies. And we have been lacking it, especially in state colleges here in Florida. I've been to multiple because unfortunately of my disability, I had to find the right college for me that accommodated me. And I had to kind of take my tumble to find the right one. And one thing that I definitely have to say is that invisible disabilities, until they become visible, are not seen by some colleges still. And that was a fight to get there. And I have to say that we're seeing some progress, but not as much. And that actually is from faculty sometimes more than in the administration, because the administration has a lot of those new, like fibromyalgia, arthritis, all this stuff that can be visible and invisible. But then the faculty go, but you don't look sick. And it's really hurtful. And it's saying like, well, do I not have the same capabilities as somebody that has autism or visible disability because mine was invisible? And unfortunately, I experienced that because I was not restricted. I say restricted to a mobility aid in their eyes, and they call it a restriction. Like, oh, they're restricted in the mobility aid. They can't move. And it's a lot of the vocabulary that some of the higher ed uses is very degrading. Until I had the cane, my invisible disability was not considered a disability by my first college. Because it was at that point, the fibromyalgia was the most key factor. All the other disabilities were something that I can still handle, but they didn't see it as such. They're like, oh, you could still work, you could still do all this stuff. And I actually think that that same philosophy kind of trails down, or it trickles down from how Social Security disability sees disability. And I think that those same documentations are being used in colleges, and they're not like seeing the relationship or the evolving a part of disability, that it can have different colors, sizes, shapes, and forms. And it's not the same thing that those guides say that they are. So it takes a lot of self-advocacy. Also, it takes for you to voice your opinion, like, hey, I need this accommodation. Why is it not being offered? Can we make some type of compromise? Can we do something? But the first step is actually finding out that that accommodation can even be offered. And that's sometimes the hardest thing.
Such great insights about the unique experiences of adult students. I want to hear from Jay next. You seem to have some experience in that arena for adult students. Jay, what are some of the things that are particularly difficult for adult students and also educators of adult students with disabilities? And what are some tips that you might have for those in that situation?
Okay, well, I think the first thing to say is, yes, we have offices of disability services. They're generally really underfunded and understaffed. The average operating budget is around $250,000 a year. That pays for an assistant football coach at most of these schools. And we're hiring more and more assistant football coaches. We're not hiring more and more people to work. The caseloads are gigantic. And the accommodations they're offering are really narrow. So around 2/3 of accommodations are the exact same thing, which is extended time on tests and exams, which is important. We need that, right? But what we need a lot less of are timed tests and exams. We don't need a whole lot more of these accommodations. We need a much different paradigm of teaching, right? And I think it gets back to some of the changes that were made during COVID. We did change these things very temporarily. But universities are we get constructed as really liberal places, like full of radicals. They're unbelievably conservative places that keep doing the same things over and over again. And we don't match. You look at the mission statement of a college or university, it's all about innovation, ingenuity, entrepreneurship, collaboration, and classrooms should look more like that. Some of them do, most of them don't. Most of them don't. And so, students are forced to jump through a lot of hoops to get these accommodations for really outdated modes of teaching and learning. Faculty should have to prove why they're giving time tests and exams. There's no good pedagogical, no good teaching or learning reason to do it. Students don't learn better or more at all. I could really soapbox about this all day, but I think the issue is we need a broader repertoire of accommodations, and we should learn from K-12, right? We should learn from universal design from learning, right? We should learn from disability justice, from how we make things accessible to a broader community. But we don't, right? And we need to. And I think a big piece of it is that the kind of pipeline around disability is squeezes people out, right? So if you look at, the graduation rates for students with disabilities are scary. They're so low, right? And when students do graduate, they graduate with 60% more debt than other students. And rates of graduate school attendance are way, way low, right? A good, powerful comment in the chat was about, the 50% of PhD students with disabilities drop out. There's so few faculty with disabilities, and there's a reason for that, right? Faculty, we can't even get accommodations. Most universities in Canada do not have a policy for accommodating faculty in the workplace. It's a violation of human rights, but it happens, right? So we can have a strong infrastructure for accommodating students in the classroom, but no infrastructure for accommodating their teachers when those teachers are disabled. And so things don't change. And the stigma is allowed to persist. We can't imagine the person at the front of the room being disabled. And so we're empowering people to imagine that the students aren't either, or that if they're not, they shouldn't admit to it or shouldn't seek help. I guess I could keep going about this, but I think that the biggest piece is actually that there are policy pieces, right? That we need to advocate for transparency in offices of accessibility to say, what are the range of accommodations here? It can't be a game where we don't know what we're asking for, right? Because we're asked to take a big risk in terms of disclosing disability on a college or university campus. And of accommodations is to expand to fit the kinds of classrooms that we want to be building for the future, right? Rather than constantly retrofitting this really bad old model of teaching.
Very powerful narrative there, Jay, about the unique experiences of students and adults with disabilities. I want to hear from Jade, because Jay talked about professors with disabilities, and you are one. How is that experience unique? And what are some tips that you have for educators who are maybe seeking accommodations as well? You're muted, Jade. Can you hear us? I'm not sure what's going on with Jade. But while we figure out the tech there, let's hear from Merlyna. What do you think the unique challenges and opportunities for adult students are, and educators with disabilities? And what are some tips that you have for those seeking accommodation?
Well, living in the elementary school world, I have limited experience with adult learners and the accommodations and supports they might need. Although I've had numerous former students and their families come back to me to say, you know, I need assistance, I need support. My child is going off to the university, and for many of my parents, it's been frustrating because the child, the student, the young adult starts to say, I don't want to disclose that I have a disability. I want to, you know, not live with that stigma that could come along with it. And I said, you know, I can't understand why they wouldn't want the very accommodation that could make them successful. And, you know, I've had parents say, well, you know, they've been bullied throughout much of their K-12 education. And so now they feel like this is a fresh start with new people. And so there's this ability, you know, fear that they have that they're going to disclose something that will once again cause them to be isolated and not belong. And so I've had to talk them through, you know, what are the things you can do? And then the parents say, I'm extremely frustrated because in K-12, I'm at the table when their IEPs, their individual educational plans are written, or their 504 plans are written, and accommodations are chosen. But, you know, at the university, I'm not at the table. So my child is now left to advocate and to know their rights. And that's a thing that a skill that has not been taught and something that they're not comfortable doing. And so I feel like that is where a big disconnect happens for many of our students who are going to become adult learners, that transition from what K-12 was like and how the process went and what documentation was needed, what accommodations were given. And now here they are in a different institution and a different university in a different setting. And many of them don't know how to advocate and to, you know, fight for what they need. Many of them don't want the accommodations if it means that they're going to be, you know, singled out or feel like they won't belong and won't be accepted as they may have felt throughout their K-12 education. And so that's the experiences that I've had. I have a personal twist on that. I have a family member who had some learning disabilities and went to college and would not advocate for himself and chose not to have accommodations and things that he needed, modifications, because he did not want to feel the social isolation that he felt throughout his high school career. And so it was a battle because I knew what he needed and I knew what would make him successful, but he chose to go a different route, and it became a very, very trying time for him. And as an adult learner, he was not successful in that setting because of that choice that he made. And so I think there's a lot of things that we still need to do to make that transition from K-12 to higher learning and make it something that we prepare our students for, we prepare our parents and families for, and the universities for. So there's a lot of work to do there. I'm still not, as Jade has said, an expert in that area. I'm just speaking from personal experiences that we had in my family as well as a former educator.
Thank you for that. I do have one final question that I do want to get to before we get to our Q&A. I don't want to rush you, but I do want to make time for our Q&A. So I'll ask this question quickly and maybe we can get through our answers a little bit quick. Intersectionality is such an important part of this process, the identities of those that we're talking about at every level, every role. And my question for any and all the panelists who would like to speak to this real quick, do you think that disability studies should be equally as required in our classrooms to be taught and understood by students regardless of their identity, equal and beside other social issues that we talk about in classrooms and that we make a point to teach in order to move progress forward? Do you think that's part of the answer, or do you think it's something else? Jay, let's hear from you first.
Okay, I'll be quick. I don't know what that would look like, and I've never really heard a call for like mandatory disability studies courses, because I think the answer is actually an intersectional answer. So on college and university campuses, disability is talked about a ton. It's a huge research industry, but it's all oriented around cure. It's all oriented around genetic solutions that eradicate disability, mostly, right? And so to me, those same students who are being exposed to talking and thinking through disability through, frankly, a fairly eugenic lens, need to understand from the perspective of disabled people, the value of their lives and of disability culture, right? The history of the fight for disability rights, the history of eugenics, so that they can come to these discourses, not push towards a paradigm that seeks to eradicate disability, but one that seeks to celebrate it.
I love that answer. Do any of our other panelists want to speak on this before we get to our Q&A? We have a ton of questions from our audience, which is really exciting, and I want to make sure we have time for those. Before we get there, does anyone have any thoughts on disability studies and whether that's part of the solution for ableism in education?
I guess I can throw my hat in the ring. As a leader in student government, I recently lost my mother back in July, who was my biggest advocate and actually was always on campus with me as my caregiver. And without her, I noticed that I didn't have a lot of the accommodations that I needed. And her help was a lot more than I thought when I was on campus. And by speaking my concerns out, not only to the Student Center of Disabilities and also to my SGA team and everything, they started to have that conversation at what we call make a mark events, which are like, let's talk about some hard issues to discuss as a student. How do you feel about them? And some of those things came up as inclusion in honor of October being Disability Employment Month, is, you know, looking at how do you treat a coworker that has a disability that may not be comfortable with disclosing it? Or how do you treat somebody that's in a mobility aid? And do you treat them on basis of what they're using as to be the mobility aid or the person behind it? And have those like really strong conversations with peers. And some stated that they never even knew that that was a thing, that it was disrespectful. And that's when we like introduced the term of ableism. And now the month of October at our school, it has an anti-ableism campaign, and having those conversations with the students. And it was not easy to be the face of that campaign because I am disabled, but it actually brought on like different peers that were like, hey, the fact that you're comfortable saying it, it makes me a little bit more comfortable to say it as well. I have a learning disability. I have dyslexia that I've neglected for the past 5-6 years. So I would have to say maybe like coming out of that shell and making, the conversation known might help, or also maybe including it in somehow the way that we include a government class, like an inclusivity class or ethics class, something that touches upon that subject before you go out onto the real world. Maybe a possible solution, but I don't know if college students will take it, or it will be an elective or something of the sort, but at least something out there. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. I do want to move to the Q&A and give you guys a chance to answer some of the questions from our audience. Our first question that I want to ask, because it was not a topic that we touched on very much today, we have a question from a parent in the chat about how, as a parent, can they best support their child to self-advocate as they are getting older, especially as they're becoming an adult, for their physical and learning disabilities. How do we support our children in their journey to self-advocacy? I think Merlyna talked about the self-advocacy aspect of that. Do you have any thoughts about how parents can really help their students become strong, empowered self-advocates for themselves?
I'm thinking back to the grade levels that I work with. Oftentimes at the table, the student was not a part of the conversation. It would be just the parents, especially throughout their elementary career. And so I started thinking to high school and wondering, and even at the university level, I'm just wondering how much is that child included in those conversations when it is time for that IEP to be written or an accommodation plan to be written? Because in the elementary grades, they're not at the table. It is the family, the parents, and the guardians who are there. And so I'm starting to think that in high school, is there a way for us to include students in those conversations, to have them at the table, letting us know what works, what does, what will not work for them, and what are things that they can do, and begin those conversations middle school and high school with our students, and having them become a part of conversations that actually impact how they will be instructed and how they will learn and what they will do on a daily basis in school, so that when they do become adult learners, they are better equipped to be able to advocate for themselves. And so I think we need to have conversations with our middle and high school students and their families, and talking about how do we include them more in the decision-making processes, so that when they are required to do that for themselves, they'll be better equipped and able to actually self-advocate. So I think it's something that has to be taught to those students, and it has to be a collaborative effort between the families and the schools to make that happen. And just knowing a little bit about what I've seen work in our middle and high schools, some of this is already happening. So I'm thinking that's a great place to start.
I hope that answered the question that was put in there. I think that's a great answer. We have a question for Jade. How do you, as a person with disabilities and also an educator, serving in so many different roles within the education system, how do you deal with the inordinate amount of labor that it takes as a disabled person to thrive and survive within the construct of the education system, while also having your own needs met at the same time? The person in the chat talked about, there are so many hoops to jump through, and it can really deplete a person's spoons when they're trying to just get through the day, much less seeking accommodations on top of that. How do you deal with that on a daily basis?
A lot of it is, time management, and really being aware of, on my worst day, kind of going from what I know might be like my limit on my worst days, and thinking, okay, say that every day for me was my worst day all semester. What is the maximum that I think I can do? And I actually have to think in those terms, because my disease is relapsing and remitting. It's Crohn's, so it's like sometimes it's fine, and then some days it's totally not fine. So for me, you know, my job is contracted. I did that on purpose. Like, I took the adjunct job because it's hourly. I can take as many classes per semester, like, to teach as I want to. So like during COVID, I'm doing only one right now because I don't want to put myself and expose myself to the environment of, you know, all those students, and I don't like disease and stuff. Last year I was really sick for a while. I took a whole semester off. The semester before that, I taught 3 classes. So it's kind of to have that flexibility is really important to me, as well as like having the flexibility to, since that is something that's contracted and is kind of hourly, then depending on how I feel, I can also get like another job on the side, like a part-time job, or, you know, even one day if I really feel great, I can hopefully maybe get like a full-time job as well, and, you know, have this on the side. But it's kind of being aware of all of those things and what my limits might be, and the fact that you know, I have to take that space for myself and kind of give myself some grace, even if I don't always necessarily feel like I'm deserving of it. And, you know, be aware that at any point, technically I could end up in the hospital, or I could end up, you know, in a situation where I need to make those like different arrangements with other professors, or with my students. I'm very open with my students, for one thing too, because I feel like if I'm open with them, I hope maybe they'll be open with me about like any issues they might have. They, you know, so maybe their sense of internalized ableism isn't as bad either. You know, it's just those things, and trying to just kind of balance my disease with, you know, living life, as we all try to do with our disabilities.
I think that really answers that question well. Taking things one day at a time can be difficult, but I think for so many of us in this event, we understand how important that is. We have a question for Michelle that I think that you'll be able to answer really well. How do you personally handle and navigate ableist aggressions and microaggressions? How do you navigate that?
That one's a toughie. I have to, for one, count to 3. Definitely start off with that. Because I have to put myself in those person's shoes as well. So, for example, I try to look at it as, were they educated on what a disability is? Do they understand what ableism is? Let me try to come even back from maybe the background they come from culturally. Like, I try to look at it in all perspectives. I know this is going to sound really weird. I use a lot of dark humor on on different perspectives, but more than anything, I stand up for myself and I advocate for myself. I try to explain it. If they're willing to learn and listen, try to feel that out, you know, see if they're willing to take it on and willing to hear you out. But if they aren't, or they are the type that doesn't want to filter through, at that point, you just kind of have to say, is it worth my time? Is it worth my energy? Is it worth my spoons? Still continue to self-advocate for yourself, but there are certain battles that you just can't win, even if you try to self-advocate. And you kind of have to pick your battles as that for your own self-worth or being, or I guess protection. But one thing that I had that internal ableism that Jade was talking about, because for a while my disability was invisible. So it was weird, because when I started to use a mobility aid and I felt more comfortable in saying I am disabled, because the invisible aspect was so degrading to be told all the time, but you don't look sick, or you're just overweight, or maybe you should just go drink celery juice. That happens a lot with spoons. We're told like different other solutions, and it's very frustrating. And though that people don't see it as such, that is an ableistic microaggression. You're giving someone treatment that you yourself don't even know if it works, and can come off as a little touchy. But my suggestion is just self-advocate for yourself and see what your limitations are as well. See how, if they're willing to learn, and you can teach them something in the process. But if, unfortunately, if they're not willing to, just kind of cut your losses and move on. Just know that you kind of did what you could, but never stop fighting for yourself. That's big and foremost.
Thank you so much for that. I do want to give Jay one of our questions before we wrap up. We're almost at time, but I do want to give you this question. We had a question from one of our attendees. They're really curious to hear from you about the absolutely atrocious retention rate of students with disabilities in higher level learning, especially at the master's and PhD level. And I'm going to combine that question with, they want to know your thoughts on why that is. And we also had a question that I think segues really well with this. What can administrators at high level institutions do to help make learning easier for those students so that retention rates at those high levels of education are not as bad as they are? I know that's a huge question, but good luck.
Yeah, it's a huge and important question, because this is where we need the input of disabled people, right? We can't solve the problems that we have, be they technological problems, scientific problems, cultural problems, social problems. We need disabled people, right? We need their input, and especially now, right? To me, the graduate level, the easiest answer is the hardest. It's the hardest one to solve. And it is at the graduate level in the States, you are an employee and a student. And so you are exploited in both roles. And the gray areas that are involved there are exploited to the benefit of the institution. So whether it's your work in a lab, whether it's your labor as a teaching assistant, which is drastically underpaid, the university benefits from treating you sometimes like a student, other times like an employee, and not affording you the rights that go to either group, right? So when we push for new policies for faculty, grad students get left out. When we push for accommodations for staff, we don't see grad students as that, even though they function as staff in many ways. And the rights that undergraduate students have, lots of disability services offices throw their hands up and say, we don't work with graduate students, as though they're not students who are studying in classrooms as well. So it's a really kind of sinister game of hot potato, and grad students are really caught in the middle. The other piece is that it's a short term, right? So you're in grad school for 2 to however many, 6, 7, 10 years, still short, right? You wear people out, right? Academic spaces wear people out. So people don't hang around long enough to see things change, and institutions eject them so quickly and churn through them so quickly that it's the toughest group to advocate for themselves. It requires other people to advocate for them. And that's the role of faculty, frankly, right? That's the role of folks who are there already and have consistent employment, to be advocating for graduate students instead of exploiting them. But it's not happening.
That was a phenomenal answer to that very complex question. We are at time. I know that all of us could talk about this for hours and days. I want to thank all of you for being here so much. For those of you who are in attendance today, we encourage you to join the Facebook group, our DLC Leadership Collective, where we're going to be continuing the chat in our posts. You can comment. We're going to have, we'll be tagging those who were panelists today so that they can answer those questions as they come in, so that we can continue this important conversation, because conversation is how we move this pendulum forward. and really make the progress that we're all looking for. I also want to thank our ASL interpreters for being here today. They always make the accessibility of these events possible. And for the rest, from the rest of the Diversability team, thank you for being part of our community. We look forward to continuing conversations with all of you to make elevating disabled lives easier and more possible together.
Thank you.